Good evening and welcome to the Parent Academy Power Hour. Behind every data point is a child. My name is Sheila Kane and I'm the District Coordinator for Family and Community Engagement. We're so happy you've taken the opportunity to participate in this session. Let's take a minute and just cover some virtual ground rules in this Zoom world. Participants will stay muted when you're not speaking. There might be some speaking opportunities and I will make sure that you're able to unmute at that point. Cameras on when possible. As I said before, we like to see your beautiful faces, although we understand it's dinner time and you might be tending to some kiddos or yourself. Please use the chat box throughout the session. We're going to go ahead and take questions at the end, but questions don't always come to your head at the end. They come as the session is unraveling or unveiling. So go ahead and put the questions in there, and then we will ask our presenters to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Tonight, we actually have two presenters from Pinellas County Schools, Dr. Valerie Brim, who is the Director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships, and Dr. Dan Evans, who is the Executive Director of the Assessment, Accountability, and Research Department. Together, they will cover everything you always wanted to know and more about your child's data. Dr. Brim is going to start us out tonight. So Dr. Brim, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us to Behind Every Data Point is a Child. And I think this is going to be a very timely yet important workshop because we're now coming to the end of our first quarter, as well as probably some cycle data that has been, some assessments that have been completed. So I know as a parent, I oftentimes would attend a parent conference and I did not quite understand the jargon of the educator or the data. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about what are you planning on learning tonight? Next slide. You're going to understand the types of assessment. I know throughout the state, we hear often there's too much testing, but what does these tests show us as our students are progressing in our learning environment? You hear about progress monitoring. What is progress monitoring? What does that really mean to monitor our students' progress? We are familiar with our state required assessment, but tonight we're going to delve in a little bit more on how and what that means for you and your child and how to make sure your child is moving forward. What are some strategies to help improve your student performance based on the data? And one of the key things is that whether it's Zoom or whether it's face-to-face, oftentimes we schedule parent-teacher conferences and we go in with a mindset to learn information, but because of the level of questioning or because we didn't ask the right question, we're still not satisfied with the outcome. So near the end of our workshop, we will talk about asking the right questions. What are those questions that will make anyone think about what they're going to respond to this parent? So I am excited to invite Dan Evans to begin our workshop talking about the data. Dr. Evans is the Executive Director of Research and Accountability. So he fellowships with the data. He plans and report out to our superintendent. So he's really the expert in not only gathering the data, but also analyzing and reporting out what it means. So at this time, I would like to introduce you to Dan Evans. Dr. Evans, you could take it on.
Thank you, Dr. Brim. And Sheila, I'm seeing in the chat room, we have somebody who's maybe can't hear. And so make sure everybody is, do you want to give any further direction? Or are we okay?
I don't know. Miss Tracy, are you joining? Go ahead and put in the chat if you're joining via a mobile device or nobody else is having any trouble hearing, or I imagine you would be typing in the chat as well. You heard my questions, so I can deal with her in a private chat.
Of course, thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Evans. Thank you.
And I will reiterate what I heard from Dr. Brim, folks. We're excited to come into your homes this evening, and we are happy to answer any of your questions. We want to be as informal as needed, and please let Sheila navigate the chat room and let us get your questions answered. We are here to help you this evening. I'll go over a few slides, and then I'll pause and we'll see if I've confused anybody or there's any questions you have unique to your, your own interests. Once again, my name is Dan Evans. I'm here in my office this evening here at the district office, and as is Dr. Brim and Sheila. And we're excited to be with you. I am I do oversee our data division, which is primarily assessments and what that tells us about students and how they're doing. And I'm also a former principal, and I'm a parent, and I can answer the questions from any of those viewpoints. And I've been a long time reading and English teacher, and I'm pretty familiar with what the data say about your kids' ability to read and write. So we can answer your questions from any of those standpoints. What you're looking at here are some things we thought you might have questions about initially. So I think the first thing to note is that the state testing, we're talking about the state's test that you hear about, are typically offered at the end of every school year, right? In the spring is when you would imagine we'd offer tests, right? At the end of the school year, and generally for reading and math. And generally speaking from grades 3 to 10. So from a state testing standpoint, all kids in all school districts in Florida will take the state reading test and the state math test at the end of the school year. And a few years ago, they changed reading to ELA, English Language Arts, because there's writing and reading. So when you hear reading or ELA, it just means the students have to read and write. So it's the ELA test and the math test. And then in grades 5 and 8, they will take science, as evidenced there on the screen. And then as kids get into middle and high school, they'll have some subject area tests, which we'll talk about in a moment.
I'm a teacher.
I'll pause there. Go ahead.
I'm a teacher. So a lot of that stuff you don't have to go through from. Is it just us?
No, we have it's parents on the call here tonight.
Oh, there's other parents too?
Yes, there's 20.
Oh, okay. I thought it was just us. I'm sorry. Okay.
We're glad you're here, though.
Oh, it's been a long day, right? I'm sorry. All right. Thank you. I apologize for interrupting.
Sheila, if you go to the next slide a moment. If you see my lights go out like that, folks, it's because I'm in the building, so I have to move.
Sorry.
Yeah, it turns my lights back on. You can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So the first thing I want you to be able to distinguish, and you can take a couple of notes that might help you out, is to know that the state requires students to be tested, as I just named. And the state's test, generally speaking, goes under the name of the FSA test, the Florida Standards Test, or the Florida Standards Assessment. It used to be called the FCAT. And at the end of the day, when your son or daughter takes a test at the end of the year in reading or math or science, they'll get a 3-digit score, which is called the scale score. And that 3-digit score puts students on a scale, and that will create an achievement level. 1 being the lowest achievement level, they're struggling in that subject, and 5 being the highest. By the way, I should apologize ahead. If you see me turn over here, I'm looking at 2 screens. I'm looking at the PowerPoint and then just some additional notes I have over to the left. So if I look away, that's the reason. So I want to make you aware of the 3-digit score and the scale score. Right? I'll go there in just a moment. And know this, those students take the tests at the end of every year, generally speaking, grades 3 to 10. The data are used to help teachers identify students who need some extra help in reading or math or science. The only time that they become really high stakes, where students are held back a grade or maybe not allowed to graduate, are in grades 3 and 10. The real high stakes years are grades 3 and 10, because in grade 3, if a student doesn't do well enough, they can be retained. And I can add to that in a moment if you have questions about that. And in grade 10, if they don't pass the test, they can potentially not graduate. And that's only the reading. So at grade 3, we want to make sure students are reading at grade level, or if not, they could potentially be retained. And in grade 10, if the student doesn't do well enough, he or she could potentially not graduate, because you have to show competency in reading to graduate. The state does allow the districts to use other tests to show reading ability. So we're not just judging students based around one test, but that's the 2 years where the reading test is pretty high stakes. Yeah, I'll go one more slide, then I'll pause to see if I confuse anybody. I'll wait on Sheila.
No, I'm trying. I'm sorry.
You're
I
fine,
don't
you're
know
doing
what's wrong with my.
She's going to advance the slide for us. So this is a bunch of numbers, and I don't want to overwhelm you, but just to give you some sense of the data, what's going to happen is when your son or daughter takes the test at the end of each grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, we'll say reading and math, because those are every year. The 3-digit score they get, and let's look at 3rd grade, just as we all put our eyeballs in the same place. In 3rd grade, if your son or daughter takes a reading test, or again, ELA, reading and writing together, and he or she scores a 284 on the test, they're going to be placed at an achievement level 1, which would be the lowest achievement level. We wouldn't want them to be there. And let's say they got a 284, you see where I am, they'll be placed by the state as an achievement level 1, which would say, hey, we need to help that student get better at reading. If the student were to score a 330 in 3rd grade, they'd be in an achievement level 5, which is the highest achievement level. So if I were a parent, and I have been a parent for many, many years, I didn't really track my son's scale score, the 3-digit score, but I did know, was he trending as a level 2 reader and maybe a level 4 math student, or vice versa? In fact, I remember a year of my son, 1 year was a level 4 math kid. He was pretty good at math, and then suddenly it was a level 2 the next year, and the school called about putting him into a after-school math program because his math scores had dropped. So I would be aware of, as a parent, what level, scale level, your son or daughter is in reading and math or science. And before you kind of get too concerned about the level, know that it's typical. Most students score as a 2, 3, or 4. 2, 3, or 4, that's a typical score. And what we would consider to be a grade level, right? A grade, my son or daughter's at grade level would be level 3. So level 3 there, I've highlighted the minimum score needed to be a level 3, which the state would consider to be proficient or satisfactory for their grade level. Now, I said a lot, and I've only talked so far about the state testing, but I'll pause there because Dr. Brim may want to add a couple of things, and we'll see if there are any questions. Ma'am, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to point out to parents, which I think you should make sure you're keeping an eye on your child's scale score. So using the same grade level as Dr. Evans stated, and the child makes a 330 in the 3rd grade. And because that student is a level 5, you think you're set. But I want you to look at grade 4. If that child scores a 330 in the 4th grade, they're now a level 4. So they're regressed instead of maintaining that level 5. So you want to make sure, as you are speaking with your teacher, that you are staying on top of them, driving your kids to move to the highest level, which is 360. If they make a 360, the following year, they remain a level 5. So that's something to keep an eye on. Someone asked, where can they find their scale score? So I'm going to turn that back over to you, Dan.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so we don't overwhelm you, and it's a good question. I'm going to answer that. I was always aware of, and you should be aware of, your child's scale score. And then really what this means is his or her placement as a level. And both the score and the level, first of all, is in focus right now. You can get to it as a parent on using your parent portal. So you can always get to your son's son or daughter. I had a son, sorry. Son or daughter's scale score and achievement level. And also the teacher would know, right? The teacher could get you that information. The state does give kind of a parent copy of the score, but that's now done, in paper form, and not just because we're in the middle of the pandemic, but even before that, because we deal so much in email, and that's these days, most parents don't come in and get the piece of paper, but the state still does produce for schools a piece of paper that has your son or daughter's scale score at the end of the year and achievement level. But you don't have to wait on that because that information is in focus. And you could get to that as a parent. I should also say that just because you're on this call, but even if you weren't, parents call us all the time too. And they say, Dr. Evans, just explain to me, should I be concerned? And so we're happy, by the way, to take your calls directly into the assessment office. But I think this is really about how you dialogue with your school. And per the teacher who's on the call, she would know how to get to the student's scale score and level, right? So what we want ultimately is we want all students, obviously in the state, to be at level 3 or above, which the state would consider to be grade level. But just so you know, it is very typical for many, many students to be at level 1 and 2, not just in Pinellas County, but the state. Okay, you're going to have hundreds, thousands of students at level 1 and 2 because the test is designed to identify students who are better or worse at certain things so we can help the student get better at the thing that is their weakness. So don't panic about that, but if my son or daughter was at a level 1 or even 2, but certainly level 1 in math or reading, I would know that's something I need to work with them on with their teacher. Okay? Ms. Kane,
Sure,
or we can
Evans,
move forward, or you can other questions.
we seem to be answering them or asking them as they come now, but they seem to be the right time. So I'm going to jump in. Someone asked about, since the students didn't take FSAs last year due to COVID, how does that affect, where things are this year? Or
good question. Real good question. The short version is nobody tested last year, so there are no data from 1920. So the most recent score we'd have for your son or daughter would be 2 years ago. So we're all working off of the 1819 score. That's the latest we have from the state side. This year, assuming things don't change again, we do anticipate doing testing at the end of this school year. And at this point, we'd be back on track to do the testing in school for all students, even for the students who are learning at home. The state right now is saying we'll do testing at the end of the year in school, and we'd probably find some evening times and Saturdays for testing to occur to accommodate students safely. That's still to be determined. But we do anticipate doing state testing this year at the end of the year. Sheila.
Okay, so the follow-up was then how can a child or maybe can a child be held back this year?
Well, that's a good question. Let me go to the end of last year because I don't know what year we're referencing. So at the end of last year, since there was no test, the state gave us wide latitude not to retain students. That's the answer to that question.
Okay, so
But
it really
going forward,
last year to this year, right? Okay. And then we have some savvy parents must have double screens because somebody's already looking in focus, and they are seeing an RIT score.
That's fine too.
Wondered if that was the same or what
No,
that.
I'll go to that score in a minute, but in focus, you will see every test the student has taken. And one of the options there is the FSA score, but also our practice tests are in there, and I'm going to reference those next. Yeah, you can get to any data point for your son or daughter on focus. So they're not looking at the at that particular row is not the FSA score.
So in my early objective, I mentioned progress monitoring.
Yep.
When he gets to that discussion, just keep that in mind.
Yep, I'll come back to that.
Okay, want to go to the next slide?
Yep. I'll piece it all together for you. Okay, so let's just clarify too that in addition to reading and math, what I said, right? Every year, 3 to 10. Every student takes reading and math. In 5th grade and 8th grade, the state also tests in science. Now, again, this is not a high stakes test though. There's no one held back because of science. It's not a graduation requirement. I'm talking about the state science test. We give it in 5th and 8th grades as a state to see where we are in science. We can adjust our science curriculum as a result. Your teachers use that obviously to help your students learn more about science, but they're not as high stakes as the reading and math. And then, now I'm really getting in the weeds, as we get further along in school, there are 4 or 5 subjects that the state monitors very closely. Think of it as the big ticket subjects: algebra, geometry, biology in high school, US history, and civics. There's 5 subjects, I think I got them all there, that the state says these subjects are so important, we're creating the final exam. So in addition to the FSA, which is the year-over-year math and reading test I described, your son or daughter will take, once they take the course, those sort of high-ticket courses, the state will issue, not the district, the state will issue the state-created end-of-course exam for algebra, geometry. Those are the 2 math ones. Civics and US history for social studies, and biology in high school. Whether whatever grade your kid takes it. So for example, if your son or daughter takes algebra, which many kids do, in 7th grade or 8th grade, which is pretty typical, that's when they would take the state's algebra test. If they take algebra in 9th grade, they take it in 9th grade. And that's important because those tests do count for the final exam for that class. And those are high stakes tests because we would want them to do well. Okay? And that's the sum total of all the state tests. We're not even talking about the district's practice tests. We'll go there last, but I'll pause there to see if I confused anybody. But that's the summary of the state test that every student has to take in Pinellas County and throughout the state. Okay.
We had 2 questions. One was, if a child was a level 1 last year, at the end of the year, they were automatically moved forward?
Yes, remember, generally, yes. Remember, the only time that the state uses, in the district then, these tests to hold kids back is primarily and almost exclusively in 3rd grade. Now, again, retaining students and holding them back is a school decision. And a school uses grades for that, they use tests, but for the most part, the answer would be that the state mandated retention of kids is only in grade 3. And last year, yes, we were given wide latitude to go ahead and move kids to the next grade. But again, that's a school-based call. So let's say the example the parent is asking, well, yes, but maybe my son or daughter is a level 1 reader. The school was given the opportunity then to look at other data points and dialogue with the parent and say, yes, we think your son or daughter should be retained or not. So in that example, the exams are just one piece of that formula that schools use to just determine whether a student should be retained. And let's use the example of my own son, where he bombed the test the 1 year. See, but he was actually pretty good at math, but he bombed the test probably because he didn't take it seriously. And we wouldn't want a student held back based around, or move forward based around one data point. I hope that makes sense.
And a question about the EOCs, what happens if a student wouldn't pass them or wouldn't pass one?
Well, it's a
Before
fine,
you
think of this.
answer- I'm sorry, Dan, before you answer that, could you repeat the EOC's courses in
Yeah.
high school again as well?
So,
I'm sorry for interrupting.
no worries at all. So the 30 seconds here, because I just want to make sure I didn't leave one off. I told you I'd look over here occasionally in case I got a, yep, I was right. So EOCs, state EOCs, we tend to use that word EOCs when we're talking about the state tests because they're big ticket tests. Algebra, geometry. Whenever your son or daughter takes algebra, geometry. Biology, which would be generally in high school, obviously. Civics, which is generally in middle school, which is in middle school. And US history, which usually offered in 10th or 11th grades in high school. So whenever your son or daughter takes one of those 1, 2, 3, 5 courses, they'll take an EOC. And there is a lot riding on that because those tests, that's the final exam, right? So that'll count as the final exam grade, and that's a big deal as far as the school leaves your son or daughter's grade. Okay. I'll add one more thing, which I wasn't going to say just because it's on the slides and you can review these, I know, at your own pace. I know you'll get the slides at the end of the presentation. In addition to it being an exam grade, the algebra is a graduation requirement across Florida. So students do have to actually do well enough on the algebra test, not just to get a good exam grade, but to get a passing grade on the algebra EOC to graduate. Again, if a student doesn't ever get that algebra score, they'd have to show competency on another test. But they have to show enough algebra competency to be a graduate. All right, I'll pause there. And then the other question, I think, I'm sorry, Sheila, you were asking another question that came through. Did I get it?
No, I think you got it. It's
Okay.
good. We're good.
All right.
We're caught up on questions.
Okay, so that's the summary, folks, of the state test. Everyone offers a scale score and an achievement level, but some are more high stakes than others. And I hope I didn't confuse anybody, but I'm happy to do that. Sheila, you can change the slide.
Okay.
Now, the other thing to keep in mind, which I guess, I'm not guessing, I know we all know, is that from a national perspective and a state perspective, in addition to the state tests, the FSA, for lack of a better word, we still have the ACT and the SAT in high school, okay, which I'll get to in 1 second. And those are still critical tests for college readiness for reasons we all know. So you may not know that we offer as a district the practice SAT. There go my lights again. Sorry, Sheila. So we're conserving the taxpayer dollars here in the district administration building. The practice SAT is really, really critical. And remember, I oversee the assessment division and I was a parent. So I tuned in at the points where I knew it was important. This was one of the most important tests for me as a parent because in 9th grade and in 10th grade, all students will take the PSAT. So let's go back a second to elementary and middle. Getting your sons and daughters into a path where they're getting good practice and a good route to having good, strong reading skills and math skills to get them ready for high school gets them to a point where they take a practice SAT in 9th grade. And it has no real high stakes to it because it's a practice, but then we're able to really get a sense as a parent, oh, my son or daughter is really, really knocking it out of the park in reading or math in his or her preparation for the ACT or SAT. And the PSAT gives you very detailed breakdowns of, they're really good at this part of reading, they're really lousy at this part of math, that sort of detail. And from that practice SAT, you can go on to obviously go pay for tutoring, which is fine. We have free tutoring in our high schools. And we have now throughout the nation really robust practice websites like Khan Academy, where you can type in your son or daughter's PSAT score, and then it gives them practice questions so they can get ready for the real SAT and ACT. And obviously to take more so in 11th and 12th grades. So the PSAT is a big one. We offer it for free in the district. I would take advantage of that. We offer it for free to all students in both 9th and 10th grades. And it also suggests advanced courses that your son or daughter could take. It would say, you never thought about this, but your son or daughter might be a good fit for this advanced course or that advanced course. So, I think ultimately the PSAT is a very, very healthy opportunity for your son or daughter to get some practice.
We have no new questions. So.
Okay. And then, of course, as we know, all students, all students, let me start with all students. This Pinellas County Schools, this is a big deal. We offer free SAT and ACT testing in all high schools, beginning in, I think you're allowed to take it earlier, but certainly in 11th and 12th grades, where most kids take the SAT and ACT. Yes, on Saturdays, like we used to do it, but we also offer during the school day. And I don't have to tell you, I think we're all familiar with those two tests. As you get closer to those two tests, you'll get a good sense of how to make sense of those data from those two tests. But unless things change, they're still required one of those two in most universities and colleges to get in. And so with that in mind, along with grade point averages and all those other things that we know colleges look at. So the ACT or SAT, still critical tests for college readiness. And I should also mention, I think Dr. Brim wanted me to mention that as you get into high school, and I don't know if I heard we had any high school folks on the call, but remember where I started. Students have to do well in reading, the state test in grade 3, because it's potential retention issue. But also at some point you have to show aptitude in reading to be a high school graduate. And so the last time you take the state test is in 10th grade, I mentioned, remember? So if you do not pass, if you do not get to level 3 on that state test by 10th grade, then you cannot graduate high school because you haven't shown competency in reading. And so we don't want it to be based around one test. The state says at that point, if you do not pass the FSA in 10th grade, then you can use a really strong SAT or ACT score to show that you're not just a competent reader, but an accomplished reader. And so the SAT or ACT can also be used to meet the graduation requirement to graduate, in addition to being a college entrance test, as we all know. Let me see if I cause any questions or confusion there. If not, I'll go to my last slide.
Yep, no, people are good. Oops, sorry.
All right, so there we go. Just again, being aware of the kind of thing. Can you go back one slide, Sheila? I apologize.
No, it's me.
You're fine. No, I had one. You're fine. That's okay. It's no big deal. Just before we get into this, a reminder that with all of those tests, so I don't want to overwhelm everybody, you typically end up with a 3-digit score, scale score, which I mentioned, and you end up with an achievement level, right? So just being familiar with that is what I try to help parents and was helpful to me as a parent. Now, let's get to the last thing, which is, well, I'm just going to call them practice tests. Now, my department, who are like these assessment writers, don't like that term, but that's really what the rest of these tests are. Everything else your teacher gives, whether the teachers designed the test or the district has asked your son or daughter to take the test, they're just practice, right? We want to give enough practice tests, which we call progress monitoring, to see that your son or daughter is progressing in reading and math achievement, especially reading and math. because those are obviously the year-over-year tests. So it is typical, it's not just typical, it happens in, I think, just about every grade. You know what I say on here, grades K to 10, that every fall and every winter, we give practice tests or progress monitoring tests. Those are given by your teachers, usually designed by the district. These are not state tests. Because they're given by us, they're also low stakes, right? No one's being, I don't want to say no one because I don't know how people are using it completely, but they're not typically used for grades. They're not typically used to hold kids back. That's what I mean by lower stakes. They're used to help teachers to, help your son or daughter to read or do math better. So you'll notice that your teacher will be communicating with you, and you probably already took a practice test this year in reading or math. And again, they're lower stakes, but they're really critical for you to understand where your son or daughter is. Generally speaking, same thing. You'll get a 3-digit or a 4-digit scale score. And that places your son or daughter on in a ranking of some sort, from level 1 to level 5, as I mentioned earlier. Or in this example, you'll see the second paragraph there below, because a lot of these are national tests, it will give you your son or daughter's ranking nationally in reading and math. And we call that percentile rank, right? That would make some sense. So when I would look at my son's math and it would say, he's in the 75th percentile, what that tells me, he ranks about 75th nationally. About 25% of kids were scoring higher than him in math, but he was scoring better than 75% of kids in math. Okay? Things like that. What's normal, I hate to use that word normal or typical, statistically, I mean, students normally score around the 50th, right? The 50th percentile, when you see that, is normal. So if you saw your son or daughter at the 50th of anything, that's typical for a student who's of that age. But if they're at the 60th, they're a little ahead. If they're at the 40th, they're maybe a little behind. I wouldn't worry about any of that. What I would worry is if my son or daughter was in the lower 10th percentile or 20th percentile in something, then I would want to work with them and their teacher to improve that, because that's not where we'd want them to be, okay? So now that brings me, and that's a good place for me to end my portion or see if there are any questions. And again, I'm going to stay on the call, but the parent who was asking, if I go into focus or I ask my teacher, those other scores in focus are these practice tests, these progress monitoring tests. And the one the parent was seeing was the MAP score. That's just one example of a test we give in elementary school mostly. And that 3-digit RIT score is the scale score, but it also would give the parent a percentile rank. And I'll pause there. Good, I'm glad that was helpful. So I'll pause for questions, but to know that the more informed you are about the practice tests or these progress tests, I think help you as a parent and your son or daughter. But to know these are lower stakes tests than the state tests, which are, higher stakes. I'll pause there, Sheila, in case there's a question, or Dr. Booth.
Okay, ready for the next section. Next slide. That's just a capture. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so as Ms. Kane mentioned earlier, our department addresses family engagement. And so with the family engagement, we always try to prepare parents or build their capacity to really communicate with the educator. So now you understand all of this information regarding tests. So how do you prepare to communicate with your teacher? We're ending our first quarter, and whether you was a parent of an online student or brick and mortar, at this point, I'm hopeful that there has been a conversation with your teacher regarding your student, either in a brief Zoom meeting, which is awesome because you don't have to really go anywhere, or as you pick up your child, some level of conversation. But here is where you want to begin if there needs to be a face-to-face or an actual teacher-parent conference. And there are 4 things that we must understand. 1, as a parent, you want to be able to take time to say, what is it that I want to be communicating to my parent or to the teacher? I'm sorry. What is it about my child I think is pertinent that my teacher understands? If my child has an IEP, there might be opportunities the teacher has not yet read the CUNE folder or read the IEP. So just to be able to say, here, I want to make you abreast of the accommodations on my child's IEP. So what is the purpose of the communication? What are key components you want to cover in your conversation? What, I'm so sorry that I said IEP, but individual education plan. I do apologize. What are the key components you want to cover? And developing the method in which you want to communicate. And so when I say develop methods, there are different ways in which you might want to communicate. You might want to communicate by email. You might want to communicate by a Zoom meeting or face-to-face. Find your comfort level. And in our office, we oftentimes have parents call and ask for the parent advocate in our office to actually attend meetings with that parent for support. How to develop, and this is the key piece, the right question to create ongoing dialogue. I was a teacher, I was a principal, I am a parent, and oftentimes in working with parents, they ask me a closed-ended question, and I can say yes and no. Or I can elaborate, but if you understand the techniques of questioning, then you can have your teachers elaborate a little bit more. So next slide.
Sorry, I was replying in the chat to someone.
Yeah, and now let Dr. Brim continue, but Sheila, I see the question about getting into magnet programs. I can probably answer that one, Dr. Brim, a little bit further in the conversation.
Okay.
Okay, so we call what we call QFT, question formulation technique. And this is a process that helps parents to ask the questions regarding their child's education. And here are 5 steps. And I do this training all the time, and it supports parents, and parents are very grateful. Producing your question. If we know what you really want to go in your outcomes you want to really accomplish, in the training, we actually develop and produce your questions. Then after everything resonates and you settle, we go back to those questions and say, okay, how could I drill down to my questions to improve my questions? And say that the teacher said, okay, we have a 30 minutes only. And you, at that point, have so many questions, you want to prioritize your question to get at what you really want to leave with. The top 3 questions you really want to get information from your teacher. Strategize on the steps and how to use the questions, and then reflect on what they learned by working with their questions. What do I mean? If you ask yourself the question that you want to ask your teacher, what response are you looking for? Jot down responses that you're not the educator, but you might say, okay, if I get a message that my child is struggling in reading, what does that mean? So if I'm asking my teacher, could you expound on what do you mean my child cannot read? Is my child struggling with fluency? Is my child struggling with comprehension? Is it the vocabulary? What is it? Could you drill down and be a little bit more detailed about my child cannot read? Next slide. Okay, so producing your questions. You could just start out at home, write down your 5 questions, leave them, come back. Write down the questions as they come to your head. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about educational jargon. Just be authentic to what you want to ask your child's teacher. And then write down the statement. Then change the statement to a question. So if the statement is, my RIT score is 238, what does that mean? No, I have a RIT score 238. That's the statement. Your question would be expound on that RIT score. And if that's the projection of what my child will do on the FSA, then what instructions and strategies are you going to put in place to alter the direction of this RIT score? So those are some real drill down questions. And then write down additional questions that are related in nature, because as conversation takes place, there could be some additional questions that pop up in your head that you've already have strategized at home. Okay, our next slide, please. So what does it mean, close-ended question? And we just spoke about that. Anytime you ask a close-ended question, you're going to get a yes or you're going to get a no. Now, I know Miss Tracy is on and she's a teacher, but as a principal working with teachers and as a parent understanding teachers, and I was a teacher myself, I am not more likely or not just going to spill my guts on you challenging my teaching methodology. So the yes or no questions, I'm not going to expound. It is your expectation as a parent to ask those open-ended questions that require explanation and more information. And I can tell you this as an educator. The more that you hear, the more a teacher hears from a parent, the more attention they pay to that child in the classroom. Because they would say, oh, Miss Johnny's mom, oh, she's on it. She understands the processes, she understands the testing. And so I'm gonna make sure every dot is dotted, every I is dotted, every T is crossed, because teachers recognize parents who are very savvy and understand processes and understand the whole application piece. Next slide. So so prioritizing your question again, which 3 questions do you want to get answered first? Which 3 questions are the most important to you? And which 3 questions will help you address the problem immediately? And which 3 questions will help you figure out your next steps? So these are all key, and we will send these questions to you in the recording. Next slide. So here are some examples. Oh, you could go ahead and skip that slide, Ms. King, because we want to get to some questions and answers. These are some examples of some questions from a parent. My child is demonstrating success in reading according to her report card. She has an A in reading. But on the FSA, she's a level 1. What grade level strategies are you using in the classroom, and what strategies can I use at home? And explain to me how my kid could perform academically in reading in the classroom, and it does not crosswalk to performance on the FSA. That's a really heavy loaded question, but it's a fair question because there are 2 different assessments. There are 2 different processes. So you want to be able for that teacher to say, here is the differentiated instruction that I'm providing to make sure that that A can crosswalk to a proficiency level in reading. Another example of a question. I understand students who are performing at level 4 and 5 on the FSA have flatlined. What does that mean? Because we have multiple students in our district that are performing at 4 and 5, but you don't want to stop at that, because you want to make sure your teachers are challenging your students to be able to compete globally and to be able to make sure that they're going to excel to get into the type of college they want to get into or industry certification. So you always want to challenge, how are you pushing my kid to the next level, even though they have a 4 or 5 on the FSA? And then the most common sometime with our families, you call me daily regarding my child's behavior. Please explain what are your tier 1 and tier 2 strategies to use to address his behavior. A lot of parents don't know that there's a tier 1, tier 2 process that is built at the school for the school staff to support your child if there are behavior problems. With what we call MTSS, multi-tier support systems, we're preventing kids that are misbehaving to be misdiagnosed and placed in ESE programs inappropriately. So oftentimes we provide families with accommodations and we give it time to see if it works. Then we come back and say, let's assess our accommodations because some of the pieces are not working. Then we go to the next level. It's not until you get to that tier 3 and that there are no accommodations that have been met to improve that behavior that you should consider looking at some other options of ESE. What curriculum components are used in your class to address diversity? And that is a key. Diversity can mean multiple things, not just ethnicity, but you want to know, here is my child, here are some components that are different from others. Are you aware of my child differences and how are you addressing them in the classroom? So those are some key examples of planning your questions and your conference prior to your conference. So at this time, we can open it back up. We have 6 minutes for questions.
Dr. Evans, do you want to go back and answer the question about how test scores play a part in entry to magnet programs?
Yeah, I think, Sheila, I know you forwarded the link, and I think it's pretty complicated, so the link will explain it better than I can. I would just say for the larger group that most of our programs are open access programs. They're not magnets, they're open access. You don't need test scores. There are a few, something like an IB program that I think still use test scores. But there's very few of those programs anymore that require test scores, and you need to educate yourselves about what the thresholds are because they do change.
Okay. Dr. Brim, we had someone follow up on maybe a part of your piece, which was when parents ask teachers questions, shouldn't the teachers be giving expansive answers by default?
In the real world, that should be yes. That question should be yes, but oftentimes that's not truthful. That is why I think it's necessary for the parents to understand the communication that they want the teacher to understand, or to the communication of what information you want to gather. But plan those questions so you can get the response of the answers that you're looking for.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things to that. Agreeing with Dr. Brim here, I think, remember at the end of the day, there's 2 data points that schools use and they've always used, and ultimately reflects on graduation and ultimately career choices. One is grades and the other is test scores. And so monitoring grades and understanding along with the teacher, why is my son or daughter not making A's or B's or whatever goals you want to set with your children? And the teacher might just say, they're not turning their work in, listening very intently to what is it that this teacher is looking for in a grade? So grades is one thing, and that's typically related, but not always, per Dr. Brim's point, to the test score. A student could have an A in English, potentially, and be doing poorly on the state test, which maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, the state English test, ELA test. So understanding what is that, she's already asked, that's a great question. One thing I wanted to say about that, when getting very pointed to the teacher and what you want to know, is what specific skill in reading or math, I'm assuming in this example, the student struggling in reading ability or math ability, what can't they do, right? Is it they read too slowly? Because you could work on that at home, or the teacher could. Is it they don't know their math facts and fractions, right? So can you help me, teacher, to understand what my son or daughter struggles with specifically that is impeding their skill on these state tests? And then you could obviously work on that.
Okay, it's 6:27. We have one last comment. We can see who wants to answer this one. Concerns right now. Teachers seem overwhelmed with the juggle of managing classrooms in person and online at the same time. Some of us parents are now sitting in the classrooms with our kids virtually. We're very concerned that the teachers are not able to manage teaching both groups at the same time. We're not communicating or asking questions because we are sensing that they are all overstressed. There is a clear problem with this learning environment, and we are worried about how this is affecting all of our kids.
I'll give Dr. Brim the last word, but I'll start because I think I'll set you up perfectly, Dr.
Hey, I was going to say something too this
No,
time.
I think I know where she's going.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan. And so, to that point, and I just think the simultaneously teaching is just new to us all. That they have not had to do both platforms at the same time. So, but I would not negate the fact that if it appears to be struggling, that you do not want to contact your teacher in your compassion that they appear to be overwhelmed. Because your ultimate goal is that your child is educated to the level in which you want them to be educated. So you can contact the teacher and ask to have that private conversation about your child, and just ask about strategies that could assist those that are online from your perspective, and then for the ones in school. And so I know Tracy is on, and she is a teacher. I invite you to add to that, Tracy, from a teacher's perspective, if you would like to make any comments. And I do know it is rough, and it is fluid as well. But I think our educators are just trying to just do the best they can in this particular situation.
Sorry, shut that door. Yes, I agree. It is rough, but we are doing the best we can. And, I think sometimes how they get into social media and like teachers talk amongst each other, and then parents take it in a different way, in a different perspective than what, we have a conversation, and it's not that we can't handle your child or what's happening inside the classroom. It's just that we're drowning in all this paper trail.
Yeah, and I would say, I think I could connect that back, Tracy, to what Dr. Brim said earlier, parents on the call, that even if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic and doing this kind of teaching, which is certainly stressful for folks at home, generally we're all overwhelmed anyway, including our teachers,
Right.
juggling lots of things. So the more we can understand that and then ask those more pointed questions to try to get to what can, I think would go a long way to getting your questions answered, parents.
Being specific and being active and engage with your child, and your child's teacher, having that relationship is the best. It is the ultimate goal for me as a teacher. And then now here I am as a mom, trying to still establish that too. But that is the best that we can do for our kids. is keep it
Tracy, I
going.
love what you said there about a relationship, and I just thought I'd end it this way, and then we'll, stop the recording and go on with our evenings. But the reaching out, with grace and with kindness to your child's teacher and acknowledging, the situation, but then asking how you can help at home actually ends up assisting the teacher. They want you to ask, as Tracy just said. She wants parents to reach out. She wants to partner because, although the first, reaction might be a little bit of a sigh, or, you might be imagining an eye roll, the ultimate goal is to do that, to partner, to have you support them at home, and then the child, succeeds or achieves, more than where they are at the moment, and everybody's moving forward and happy. So
Yeah, relationship is the key to your child's success, including my child with you. We've got to have that relationship. Thank you.
that's a perfect way to end our evening.
Thank you.
Thanks
Dr.
everybody for,
Thank
for
you.
joining.
Thanks.
We will be sending the recording link and the PowerPoint, so you'll have all that information in your email tomorrow. And we have many Parent Academy Power Hours coming up. We actually have one on Thursday. It's about the importance of literacy and supports and tools for you at home. That would be actually offered by our friends at the Juvenile Welfare Board. It's a panel of speakers, very exciting. So check it all out at pcsb.org/parentacademy. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.